Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Matwaychuk, and I didn't have a time this week to write an intermittent reinforcement email, so I thought I'd check in with you on the principles of REBT via this video. One of the things that I was thinking about this morning was how it's very difficult to get people to engage in the disputing process. They seem to understand REBT, but they use these ideas in a very passive sort of way. And one of the things that we're trained in as psychotherapists is to direct the patient's attention to the rigid and extreme attitudes that they hold. And so when you're in a state of emotional upset, it's very important for you to stop and reflect upon what are the rigid demands that you're using to upset yourself. Now, remember the theory says that there are three basic ideas at the core of disturbance. It's a demand on the self, I must do ideally well. A demand on another person, you must treat me as I wish to be treated. And finally, a demand on life, that life must be a certain way, easy, comfortable, fair. And the theory says that from these three, lie three derivatives. Now, traditionally, we've always talked about awfulizing first, but I'm going to talk about unbearability first. And I'll tell you a little later on in this video why I'm going to talk about that first. So when a person holds a rigid attitude, they then jump to one of three extreme attitudes. One is it's unbearable. Two is it's awful, it's horrible, or it's the end of the world. And three, we have depreciation of the self, the depreciation of others, or depreciation of life in a global way. So you might say, I'm a loser. You might say the other person's a jerk. You might say, because a part of life is bad, the whole of it's bad. Now, first to this part about active engagement. In REBT, we want you to challenge the rigid attitude, but first you have to identify it. So when you're upset and you're looking to transform your emotional experience into a healthy one, you need to first look for that must or the extreme attitude if you really can't identify the must. And you need then to articulate it to yourself. Once you've identified the attitude, like, for example, I have to do perfectly well, otherwise I really can't bear facing the public, what you need to do then is you need to challenge this. We've called this disputing, and disputing involves asking at least two or three very important questions. The first question is a functional one. Does this attitude help me or hurt me? That's a very important question. Rigid and extreme attitudes tend to hurt us. They tend to diminish our ability to cope and function. The second question is, well, if it's hurtful, well, what then would be a helpful attitude? And that question will lead you to begin the process of reflecting on a more healthy attitude towards whatever adversity you're facing. Now, the second question you want to ask is, well, is there evidence to support my rigid attitude or my extreme attitude? In other words, is it true? Is there observable data that supports it? So when, for example, I say I have to do these videos perfectly well, not make any errors in them, well, of course, I do make errors, and the presence of that error shows that my attitude is not supported by the available observable data. So once you've seen that the attitude is not supported by the available observable data, you ask yourself, well, if it's false, why is it false? That's very important to see why it's false. You don't just want to say, okay, my attitude's false, not supported. But you want to specify why it is, reflect on that. And then lastly, you want to create an attitude that is consistent with empirical data. So for example, in my case, it's I'd like to produce a video that is perfectly presented without any hiccups, but sadly, because I'm a fallible human, I can't do that, and I really don't have to do that. Okay? So now I have my rational attitude, and that's the attitude that I'm going to try to rehearse and then live in harmony with, implement in my life, so that I have a healthy negative emotion to the adversity I'm facing. The last bit of information I want to impart to you today is I mentioned earlier that we often present awfulizing as the first derivative and then unbearability, but I'm beginning to think it might be better to reverse the order, and I'll tell you why. When something bad occurs, if you can help yourself to see that you could bear it, once you've gotten to the point where you say, well, this adversity is uncomfortable, difficult to bear, but not unbearable, it then becomes easier for you to challenge your extreme attitude that it's awful, terrible, at the end of the world. And you begin to be, you have a better chance of seeing that things are always bad when they're bad, but never awful, because no matter how bad they are, they could still be worse, and good can come from bad. And so the point I'm making here is that rather than saying there are 3 rigid attitudes on the self, others, and life, and 3 derivatives, I think we want to present the derivatives this way, that derivative number 1 is that things can be unbearable, or I can at least think they're that way and get myself upset. They're awful, and then I might add as the third derivative that either myself or other people or life are totally bad. So to summarize today, I'm going to encourage you to engage with your thinking when you're upset in an unhealthy state of mind and functioning by actively thinking about your thinking. Try to identify the must. Try to identify one of the extreme derivatives. And then ask those questions that I went through earlier in this audio. Don't be lazy and passive about your practice of REBT, because it's really a discipline of the mind, and we're trying to get you to really discipline your mind to think about your thinking and then adopt healthier attitudes on a more consistent basis. I'd also like to take this moment to remind you that every Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern, I hold a conversation with a volunteer, and the people that watch this conversation often find it to be very helpful in understanding REBT. So I would encourage you to attend on Saturday. I'll mention to you that in London it's at 2 p.m., in Paris it's at 3, in Bucharest it's at 4 p.m., in Moscow it's at 4 p.m., in New Delhi it's at 6:30, and in Tokyo it's at 10 p.m. on Saturday. And if we want to go all the way to New Zealand or Sydney, we could say it's on Sunday morning at midnight. So I hope that you join me. You can get a Zoom invitation by writing to me at rebtdoctor@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send you a Zoom invitation to attend. Or alternatively, you can go to my Facebook page, Walter Matwaychuk, and watch it there. It's live streamed there. I could use a volunteer for this week, so please feel free to send me an email if you'd like to volunteer. I hope to see you on Saturday, and once again, actively engage with your thinking.